Kat. Glad to see you today. So, what have you been thinking about this week?
Well, in the monthly meetup group for the self-love journey, we've been talking a lot about self-forgiveness. Like, how do you forgive yourself if, for example, you've hurt somebody you love or you made a mistake? We all have so many things we've done in our past that we might have some regret about or shame about. And so when we're thinking about loving ourselves deeply and accepting ourselves and being our authentic selves in the world, so many of us go around and we're so afraid of making mistakes, we don't try a lot of things. Um, and so when we do make mistakes, because they're inevitable and we're human, how do we accept our humanity and how do we forgive ourselves? Like we may be slow or fast to forgive others. I don't know. Like it depends on the situation and what somebody's done to us. And a lot of us hold grudges. When we hold grudges against others, it's likely that we also hold grudges against ourselves. And so learning to let go of the mistakes and forgive ourselves and others. So we're exploring how do you do that?
How do you do that? I mean, I have this relentless voice in my head that keeps replaying it over and over again and just says what an idiot you were and how could you be so mean and how could, on and on and on. So, how do I get past that?
Yeah, I'm just thinking about how we tell a lot of stories, right? And it's like
Yeah.
very easy. I know in most of my stories it's that I'm my worst critic. I think I tell a lot of stories about if I say the wrong thing or I stumble or make a mistake that yeah, that it's just the worst thing. Like you say, I'll play it over and over again in my head and it will stick there 3 o'clock in the morning and wake me up. And yet also if someone else were to make the same mistake that I was making, it would be so easy to just be like, yeah, they're just human. It's just one
Mhm.
of those things. It's so easy to be compassionate
Yeah.
when it
Hmm.
comes to others. I mean, I understand the grudge stuff too, and also recognizing that's a story as well. And it's one that lives in me. Like sometimes the things that I'll get upset with others, they just move on with their day and their life, didn't even realize that it had affected me, but it kind of lives on in me and grows in me and becomes this giant thing that if I found an authentic way to talk with them about it, it would probably, yeah, wouldn't be all that big of a deal. Depending on what it is, obviously. There are more extreme examples of that in the world, but yeah,
Yeah.
it's interesting.
Yeah. So, how do we get past it?
One of the things you were saying about, oh, my brain isn't working right now. Sorry.
That's
Um,
okay.
and that's a good illustration, right?
Mhm.
Letting go of the idea of perfection, like we have to do it right. Um,
Mhm.
some of us, like myself, avoid doing things or saying things because we're afraid we'll screw it up. Like, so I just don't say anything. We, um, and I notice that a lot with my students when I teach. Nobody wants to speak up because they're afraid of looking stupid or
Mhm.
afraid of that other people will judge what they say. And I remember being, even at this age, I still do it to some extent. Like, I don't talk about controversial things generally, except for people very close to me, because I don't want to be misunderstood. The people very close to me will understand the spirit in which I say something, or, so a lot of
Mhm.
times we hold back just out of fear of being judged or misunderstood, and then there's the element of that we think we're supposed to be perfect and do everything perfect. And like, if we have to admit we did something wrong, we're like mortified. And like, where does that come from? I mean, obviously from our socialization, everybody's telling us, you're not worthy if you're not perfect. And it's like, nobody likes somebody who's perfect. I mean, we want to see the humanity in people, the imperfections. That's what makes us endearing and approachable, right? Because like if you think about the people you love most and care about most, you can probably name several imperfections they have. or ways in which they allow themselves to not be perfect, which makes them more approachable and vulnerable. At least I've certainly noticed that.
Yeah, I think sometimes it's people's imperfections that make them easier to be around. You know, it's just this idea of like seeing ourselves reflected in others. We know we're not perfect. We know that we're going to stumble and fail and keep trying and all of these things. But when we can recognize that in someone else, I mean, I know like if I find someone who is projecting some kind of idea of perfection, you know, and there are definitely people in the world that will do that and they're good at doing that, but it's not as comfortable to be around them because yeah, it's not a reflection of who I am, you know, and it does feel like there's um, some disingenuine kind of aspect to that because we know that we all struggle. And one thing that comes to mind for me is this idea too. Like I was thinking the other day about how powerful our imagination is. You know, in addition to telling stories, our brain doesn't necessarily differentiate between, you know, a powerful imagining or inner experience than it does that something happens in the outside world. So in that idea that would, you know, we might not want to speak up for fear of failing or something or fear of being misperceived. In a sense, even that thought is an experience that we're giving ourselves of that happening, you know, the self-rejection kind of thing. And it becomes paralyzing because we're building this little database of imaginary experiences um, that will increase this self-rejection kind of feeling, you know, that keeps us from wanting to reach out into the world. And also recognizing that one of the aspects of growth and learning and expanding and evolving is being imperfect. It is making mistakes and finding sometimes we say the wrong things and that we can learn from that. For me, one of the things I've learned in that is um, I don't know if I can give a whole lot of context on this, but recognizing that I had a belief when I was younger that if I had an argument with someone or I said something that was misperceived, and there was a disagreement, it was just over. That was the end of my connection or relationship to them. And recognizing that as I allow myself to fail a little bit in the world or say things that are misperceived, you know, recognizing if that connection is strong enough that we work through it, it doesn't fall away, right? It's just, but I'm not allowing myself to have those experiences in the way, you know, in a compassionate way. I'm just being critical, even though that's part of my evolution and growth is to allow myself to have those experiences.
Yeah.
It's very,
I used to have that similar belief that if I said no to somebody, that would end our friendship or our relationship because if
Mhm.
I couldn't be there for them anytime they asked, then somehow I wasn't worthy. And so I ended up through a lot of my life doing things I didn't really want to do because I was afraid to say no because they might not like that or they might just say, well, screw you then. I'm not going to be your friend. And then I said no one time and it was fine. And I was like, oh, okay, that's good. Sometimes I still struggle with that, however. But
Mhm.
it's that whole sense of somehow the story I tell myself is I'm not worthy enough so that if I don't go along with somebody and do whatever they want, then somehow there's something wrong with me and they won't like me. That's I mean, for me, that's part of the story.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Um, two things. One is that Tim, when you were talking about the thinking something has the same effect in your body. Somebody, I can't remember who says belief becomes biology.
Mhm.
And I was listening to Joe Dispenza talking about how just what you said, how like when you picture something, it actually creates the same chemicals in your body as if the experience actually happened, which formulates the atmosphere for your cells and how they react and respond. So if you're thinking stressful thoughts, your body is stressed, even if you're not in the actual situation, but your brain doesn't know the difference.
Yeah, and what's so interesting about that is when you're one of those places and you're releasing all those chemicals and you're anticipating or embracing for something bad to happen, you're actually kind of putting yourself in a dysregulated fight or flight place. And when you're in that nervous system kind of reaction place, your body is reacting by shutting down everything it doesn't need, which includes the logical kind of decision-making parts of our brain, and we become more reactive, and then we tend to say the things that we may actually need to ask forgiveness for. It's just so it's like how, and maybe that's part of the key to all of it, is just like, how can we bring awareness to the fact that this is happening in such a way that that we can have compassion for ourselves, or we can regulate and remind ourselves that everyone is imperfect, and so are we. That we can recognize that if something happens that's a dissonance or disagreement, or maybe even something that we need to ask forgiveness for, or forgive in ourselves, that we can still create those opportunities. It's like we can still course correct as we go. It's that finality of everything. It's that idea that for me, it's that really is that idea that if I make a mistake, it's just over and done. And that's a pretty terrifying place to live from. So how can I alter my beliefs in such a way that, one, I can be compassionate for myself and for others, and also, just be able to allow for the fluidity of life to unfold, and our imperfections, and it to be a part of that as well.
Yeah. And like the fight and flight, I'm learning about, this is the second point what Laurie was saying about people pleasing, basically. That fawning is, so there's fight, flight, freeze, and now they're starting to talk more about fawning, which is when you do what you think somebody else wants you to do, or you're people pleasing, or you're, being subservient in order to be safe, or to think, to be what you think is safe emotionally, or maybe even physically. But that's like a response that's really interesting to look at too, is like all our behaviors that we do to fit in, to belong, to not be cast out, whether it's from our family or our larger tribe or community, all the ways we hold ourselves and hide ourselves because we're scared. And it doesn't feel safe. And for example, my humanity is regularly ridiculed in my current job, is teaching teenagers. Like they're so unbelievably disrespectful and mean to me, like treating me like I'm not a person. And so like I'm working on the 4 agreements with that, not taking it personally. And I'm having to, so backing up, I had a really bad experience just before break, and I made a mistake, and I talked really rudely back to one of my students because my nervous system was shot at that point. And I have to forgive myself for that, right? And I wouldn't have learned the important lesson that I learned that day if I hadn't lost my temper. So there's a benefit to being imperfect, because that's when you learn. Your biggest mistakes are your biggest teachers, right? And so I still have to go back and face those kids, and I've apologized for, what I said, and I still get all that feedback. And like, so a student told me today, don't get up in your feelings. And I'm like, I'm human. Of course I'm going to be in my feelings when you're being horrible to me, right? So there's just layers of it. You learn one lesson, and then the universe brings you the next follow-up lesson to that. And it's like, we never stop learning. I'm not going to ever master this, but I am getting better at it each time, or at least I'm learning a lesson, and then the next lesson comes. So to me, it's all meant to be, to some extent.
Do you think sometimes these situations that we're talking about, we bring them into our lives to reflect ourselves back to us, or to reflect back something that we need to be more conscious of about ourselves? Like, is everyone in our immediate environment that we interact with on a regular basis mirrors for us? Like, what are the students represent, mirroring back to you, so that you can take a look at that and shift something? I don't know. I'm just throwing that out there. It's like, as I'm thinking about situations that I've been in, it's like when I've had things mirrored back, I didn't always like it, but when I really stopped and thought about it, it's like, maybe, there's something in me that is creating this experience that I need to take a look at. Like if I'm afraid to say no to somebody, what does that mean about me? And what is it that I need to be more conscious of?
Well, it really is hard to not take those things in, right? And
Oh.
even going along with the nervous system kind of thing, it's like, we have this whole database of experiences from our childhood that kind of forms how we move through the world. And when something that's said to us is connected to that one of those experiences in some way or another, it feels like a true danger,
Mhm.
right? I guess, and thinking about our biological wiring, it's like we're not biologically evolutionarily wired to navigate the complexity of the world that we've created and we currently live in. It's like we're still catching up with that in such a way that yeah, it's like it really is fight or flight in some of those cases, and then it really is acting in a instinctual responsive way to things, and then it's re-regulating, and then you're sitting with the thoughts of like, oh, what did I just do? And that's when this other evolved consciousness comes in and wants to tear us down or tell us all of the things that we could have done differently because we're back in our logical critical thinking space again. And that kind of comes back to this original question, is like, what do we need to do to be able to forgive ourselves in those situations when we don't act exactly in the way that we think we should, or we take on more than we should and realize that it wasn't about us, or whatever it is. And also adding to the complexity is sometimes people do push our boundaries in a way that we probably have a valid reason to want to defend ourselves, or to set our own boundary and to say this is not okay. But it gets so
Yeah.
complex.
I know
That's-
I had an experience where um, somebody stood me up, and I immediately got angry and was upset and hurt. And then as I was moving along with the day, it suddenly occurred to me, it's not about me. It's nothing personal about me. And suddenly I could see it was their behavior, it was their story, it was whatever they needed to do that day, but it really had nothing to do with me. And once I was able to see that, then everything shifted and my feelings shifted. And I wasn't angry and I wasn't hurt anymore. And I didn't make up this story about how I'm not worthy, they just don't like me, whatever story I would have made up. So you're right, Tim, is like when I can stop and step back a minute and really look at it from a different perspective and not, like you were saying, the four agreements, not take it personally,
Mhm.
then it shifts everything because it shifts my belief about myself as well as about the other person and what really happened.
So
And maybe, yeah,
with that
That's a
present in your mind, Kat, how do you not take things personally? Is that
yeah,
Well, when Laurie was saying that, I was just
yeah.
thinking, they talk about, even if it's in the four agreements, they talk about even if it's directed at you, it's actually not personal. And
right.
I can see that, like how somebody else treats you is about them, not about you, but it feels like it's about you because they're treating you that way, right?
Mhm.
And so, like when somebody's being like, if they're late, that's inconsiderate, right? And you can then say that's about them. But when they're calling you names and they're saying you're a whatever and they're making fun of your humanity, again, it's still not about you, but it feels more about you, right?
Mhm.
And then like when I choose to stay calm instead of getting angry in that situation, like my heart right now is, even as I'm saying that, my heart hurts. I'm choosing to stay calm and overriding my anger. And that feels sort of damaging to me, actually, because my anger is a natural response to being mistreated. And one of the other teachers was talking to me after school today and said, it's like being in an abusive relationship. We are consistently abused. We're verbally and emotionally abused by these kids every day. And we stay calm because we're professionals. But what is the cost of staying calm? And like I've been shaking all day. I've been shaking out my hands, I've been shaking my body, I've been moving. like move the energy, move the energy. And I think that's an important aspect of clearing the energy. But still, there's so much that is moving into my body in the form of pain. And it's like, I have to figure out what that's telling me. Because the cost of staying calm when your response is justified anger at being mistreated.
Mhm.
But then, like, there's so many layers to it. Like, is it really justified? And Laurie, what you said about mirroring back. So going back to what you were saying, like, what am I must be in some level, at least according to Joe Dispenza, creating this in my life. Like, I'm putting the energy out there and pulling this into me for whatever lessons I have. And I've been trying to think of what spiritual lessons I'm supposed to be learning from this. And so, like, I'm thinking about being able to speak my boundaries in a calm way. But like, maybe I have too much of an obsession with calmness. Maybe calm isn't the way to speak my boundaries when they're being violated. I don't know.
Mm.
Like, although I think it's more effective if you're calm, because if you start yelling at somebody, they're not listening anymore.
Right.
Because then they go into fight or flight.
Right. Well, and you're also in that position as a mirror for everyone else around you. So you're also mirroring to them how to respond to things or how to take what's being thrown at you and respond in a different way.
Well, hopefully I'm a model to them of doing it,
Mhm.
not a
Right.
mirror, because I'd be, if I were, and I have been a mirror to them. They're snotty to me, I'm snotty back. I have done that, to some degree.
Right. But mirroring back, like you're showing them from your behavior, and I use that term as a mirror, but you're showing them from your behavior, reflecting back to them, this is how you could be. This is how what's appropriate, and that you have that within you.
Yeah. That makes me think though, like, what am I showing them when I take all this abuse and don't, like, a lot of times I just ignore it. I just don't even respond because I don't know what to say.
Mhm.
And I don't want to say something unprofessional or hurtful to them. And so I'm thinking about, how do I protect myself?
Mhm.
And are there ways, going back to the forgiveness aspect of this, are there ways in which I think I deserve to be treated less than human? Like, that I deserve punishment, or that I'm not worthy, or are there ways that I don't honor myself? So, like, I'm
Yeah.
reflecting on that.
I feel like it might be worth mentioning too, like as we talk about this, like the situation that you're in, it's like it's not a normal situation you're in, right? Like you are around people who are a little bit more challenging than the normal populace. Would that be safe to say?
I'm not entirely sure,
Or do you feel
actually.
like that's, yeah.
I mean, I
Are,
think teenagers in general are pretty difficult to deal with.
sure, sure. Yeah, I find myself wondering, and I don't normally go in this direction when I'm thinking about things, but taking it in more of a metaphysical direction too, just recognizing that you have more understanding, patience, and calm than most people that I know. That, in some way, it's like we sometimes find ourselves led to the places where maybe say to use the word light workers, that light workers are led to the places where their energy and their vibration is needed in order to raise the consciousness. But it feels like a battleground because in a way it kind of is, right? Um, but it's like, when we may not see the ripples that we're casting out into the world with our way of being, but, even hearing about some of the interactions you've shared that have been more positive and reconciling and, giving these teenagers this experience of being seen, who in their normal day-to-day lives may not have that at all. That who knows the impact of that, what that will have tomorrow or a month from now or 5, 10, 15, 20 years down the road. It's been a conversation in recent times for me, just reflecting on how impactful some of my teachers were in some of the more harder times in my life. But I didn't recognize it until 40 years later, it's just, yeah, it's interesting to think about. But to hold space for that and awareness for that when you're in the midst of it and that's your day to day and you're holding that stress as a living in your body as a physical reaction to these things that feel like cruelty, and you're living in a system that's allowing that, comes back to the complexity of the things that we're navigating as a people.
Exactly. And I think it's worldwide at this point. You
Mhm.
have this little this little kind of one little system within
Microcosm or
your, yes, thank you. That's the word I was looking for.
yeah.
Yes. But I think it's very indicative of exactly where our world is right now and how we all treat each other in some ways.
That's true. And like, I mean, my little microcosm is tame compared to what's happening in parts of the world where, there's weapons involved and death involved and genocide and people starving. I mean, we're
Mhm.
not anywhere close to that. How are they dealing with, the inhumanity to be treated like your life doesn't matter, that it would be taken or you'd be, that's when I think about how upset I am about the little barbs of the day, it's like it's nothing compared,
Mhm.
and yet it still does have an impact. So
Yeah, it's an interesting spectrum because I think I'm guessing we've all kind of had that experience of like saying, who am I to feel stressed and overwhelmed when I still have a roof over my head and there's not a war zone outside? But like recognizing the human experiences, we all live on that same spectrum of emotion. It may be that one thing is not physically and outwardly as dramatic as the other, but we're still feeling the feelings in the same way. They're still living in our body in the same ways. And yeah, it's hard to know how to balance that. I was just talking to someone the other day about we are uniquely living in a time where we are connected to the rest of the world in ways that we were not 20 years ago. And speaking of not being biologically wired to deal with the stress and overwhelm, I mean, it's like it's growing exponentially, the things that we're exposed to and also feeling powerless in. Um, so yeah, how do we regulate in the midst of that? And then bringing it back to the question again, how do we forgive ourselves when we don't live up to our own expectations of how we should? It's yeah,
Right.
just gonna be my mantra for the day. It's just a lot.
it is.
It is a lot. Well, and I'm wondering, I guess my question then for myself and for both of you is then in a self-love journey, as I'm becoming more centered in my own worthiness, if you will, and loving myself, more in touch with that soul aspect of me, then how does that shift my outer world? Because it can certainly shift my inner dialogue, I think. So then does that then move outward and shift my how I operate in the world, but how the world operates back to me? Like, does it reflect back whatever I'm feeling internally?
I think sometimes certainly it does. um I don't know if it does all the time. I was thinking that
Mhm.
in terms of forgiveness for ourselves and others, having compassion for our humanity,
Mhm.
like just sitting with, I'm human and I'm gonna make mistakes and that's okay. I've written love letters to myself where I love every aspect of me, including my insecurities, my all my faults and flaws. Like I list them and I love you even though you get angry. I love you even though you make mistakes. Like there's nothing
Mhm.
you can do that would take my love away from you. So I could apply that to like a forgiveness letter. I forgive you for, maybe the right forgiveness letters to ourselves, or like I think it would be good to make some sort of formal forgiveness, like we make formal declarations of love,
Mhm.
like and commitments. Like I'm committed to loving you and supporting you even when you make mistakes. I'm not going to turn my back on you. I'm not going to beat you up. I'm not going to talk to you meanly because you screwed that up. Like if we could coach ourselves into um, giving ourselves support and love, no matter how things go for us, like we would to our child, for example,
Mhm.
for those of us with children or nieces and nephews, right? When they're little and they're learning things and they're falling when they're trying to walk and they're making mistakes. We don't go, oh, you suck at that. You messed that up. What's wrong with you? We never do that to a child. But
Mhm.
yet we do that to ourselves all the time. Why aren't I better at that? I've already tried it 3 times. Instead of try it as many times as you need, honey. This may or may not be something that you're good at. See if you enjoy it. And if you don't, then maybe we don't need to do that. Like find your joy. Which reminds me that comparison is the thief of joy, right? I can't remember who said that either, but like, and comparison in terms of like pain or, what's going on for other people, other places in the world. Our pain is our pain. It doesn't matter the source of our pain. Yeah. And so all pain needs to be held with compassion.
Yeah.
And being human is painful. Like there's so many painful things about being human.
Just because I'm on this biological wiring kick today for some reason too, like recognizing we are wired to look for danger. It's just our way of being, right? It's like, looking for the lion and the wind. It's just in our nature and in our being. And that exists in a deep place for us where if we make a mistake, we're going to be more on the alert for that, the repercussions of that, than we are if we do something right. So maybe one aspect of this, I love the idea of the letter, but one aspect of this maybe is celebrating our wins too, keeping gratitude journals,
Yeah.
writing down things that went right in our day, ending
Yeah.
with some kind of reflection around that. I was thinking the other day about if I had 6 conversations in the course of the day and 5 of them went great, and then the sixth one, there was some kind of misunderstanding, or I was misperceived, or I upset someone accidentally or intentionally, whatever, that it's going to be that sixth conversation that keeps me up at 3 o'clock in the morning. I won't remember the other 5. Like
Yes.
those are just another day in the office, so to speak. But it's the mistakes that because we're bracing for impact, or we're still looking for the lion in the wind because we need to survive whatever it is, and it might be an emotional survival as opposed to a physical one. But that we're just going to keep that on our radar. So
I wonder how we can reprogram ourselves to focus on the successes, like the 5 conversations. And how do you let that 6th conversation go? Or learn from it and let it go?
yeah,
Like
and
sometimes there's a lesson.
yeah,
Mhm.
the other aspect of what you were sharing that came up for me is how we label things too. Like, it's like if I have a misunderstanding with someone and I label it, I could label it a failure, or I could label it a lesson, I could label it an opportunity to grow. Um, yeah, it's like it really is like, how do we build our inner landscape in such a way that we see these things that might be labeled as, we're giving them the labels. Nothing is inherently good or bad. We're putting them on. I shouldn't say that, because there are probably examples we could come up with when that's a whole philosophical conversation. But this idea that often we're designating what's good and bad when it comes to emotional responses to things. Can we reframe in such a way that even those challenges and hardships are good because they're an opportunity for growth? And then we can look, is this bothering me so much that I need to take action? Is there someone I need to apologize to, or do I need to forgive myself and write that letter to myself so that I can let it go? Or is it something that I have no control over, that I'm just hanging on to, and it's ruling my days and living in my body? Um, it's kind of seeing, where do we have the power to act and not act? And if we're spending a lot of energy on the things we can't act on, then it's just punishment, right? Um,
Yeah.
self-punishment.
And the fact that we do, in fact, like you were saying, tell ourselves conversations, interactions are either good or bad somehow, rather than they just are, without putting some value on them, saying that one conversation is better than another. They're just conversations that we have. And yet, I think you're right. I mean, what you were saying is we seem to be hardwired to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't pay attention to joy. We only pay attention to the absence of joy, the misery, and we look for that. Like you can have a wonderful day, but if there was one thing that went wrong, that's the thing you remember from that day. Like I had this perfect day, and then driving home, I had a flat tire. Well, then all you can obsess about is the flat tire, not the beautiful day that you had before that.
Yeah, or even like somebody cuts you off in traffic and you just have a
Yeah.
rage moment, and then they go on with their day. They didn't even know that they did it, but it lives in
Right.
you for like 2 hours after that. Like who's creating that experience after they've moved on? Like if you're still feeling that, who's responsible for that feeling at that point?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Use that as an example because it happens to me a lot. Like I notice the road is like one of my biggest teachers these days. Driving in Kansas City.
Yep. Yep. Here too. Yes. Yeah.
I think that's universal.
Right.
Yeah. I don't know. These are amazing things to ponder.
Mhm.
So, Kat, when you figure all this out and you write your wonderful book, remember that Tim and I knew you.
Yeah, I think it's something we all figure out together. I don't know.
Yeah.
We muddle through together and
Mhm.
You
have
mean there's not
insights.
someone out there who's already written some fantastic book that has all this figured out?
Well, I mean, like I think the fifth agreement is pretty close. That has the four agreements plus the fifth.
Mhm.
Um, it's so insightful and helpful. And
Yes.
I've read it. I'm reading it again right now. I've probably read it 15 or 20 times already. It's been several years though, so I'm rereading it and it's fascinating and fantastic. And it's like, why do you keep forgetting this?
And
And
just
my
to,
own epiphanies that I have, like I read my journals through the years. I've kept journals since I was 10. And I will repeat the same epiphany, quote unquote, epiphany, like every couple of years. And it's like, you knew this 20 years ago. Why are you still doing this?
Yes.
How do you forget? But I guess you do it at a different level as well. You know, they say you spiral and it comes back around and there's nuances, you know, and it's just part of life lessons that we
Mhm.
keep going.
Yeah.
well, thank you for the conversation today, Kat. I just wanted a couple of things. When I wanted to mention, just I can't remember if you said his name, but that fifth agreement and the four agreements, that's Don Miguel Ruiz. Is that right?
Yes.
Yes.
And the fifth agreement is written with his son. I think
Okay.
it's Don Jose Ruiz. And to me, the fifth agreement explains the four agreements better than the original book, like in a way that's more accessible for me to
Mhm.
understand.
Okay.
So
Great.
yeah, I highly recommend it.
And if folks wanted to find you or know more about you and what you're up to, how would you recommend they did that?
They can find me on my website at holdyourselfsacred.com.
Okay.
And I am on Awkwardly Zen first Thursday of the month with the self-love journey, where we explore, you know, different aspects of what does it mean to love yourself
It's a wonderful group.
and
Yeah.
accept yourself. Yeah, it's a beautiful experience every month.
Yeah.
All
Great.
right.
Thanks so much for being here.
Well, thanks for having me.
So good to see you.
You too, always.